There's a piece of software running right now beneath almost everything you use. It's inside your phone, inside your bank's servers, inside the systems that route air traffic, manage power grids, process hospital records. It powers most of the internet, most of the cloud, most of the world's supercomputers. And it was built largely by volunteers, Linux, not owned by any one company, not controlled by any one government, maintained by thousands of developers across the world, many of them unpaid, working in their spare time because they believe in what they're building. And for decades, that system worked. It worked remarkably well. But now something is changing. Not because of a hack, not because of a corporate takeover, not because Linux failed, but because a set of laws written in Brussels, designed to protect people from dangerous software, may be about to rewrite the rules of who can legally build it. And the consequences of that shift are only beginning to surface. This isn't a story about Linux dying. It's a story about something more complicated, more dangerous in its subtlety. It's about what happens when the legal systems that govern corporations get applied to communities that were never meant to be corporations. And what happens when the people who build the digital infrastructure of the modern world suddenly find themselves personally liable for what they create. Almost nobody's talking about what this could mean, and the people who understand it best are the ones who are most afraid. In the last decade, Europe has become the world's most aggressive regulator of the technology industry. GDPR, the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act. One after another, Brussels has pushed through sweeping pieces of legislation designed to rein in big tech, protect consumer data, and hold powerful companies accountable. By most accounts, the intent has been good, and the results in some cases have been significant. Billions in fines, new privacy standards adopted globally, a genuine attempt to force trillion-dollar corporations to answer for their behavior. But regulation doesn't always hit its intended targets. Sometimes the ripple travels further than anyone planned. The EU's Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA, was designed to do something specific. It was designed to force manufacturers of digital products to take security seriously, to stop selling connected devices with broken firmware and no update mechanism, to stop shipping software with known vulnerabilities and zero accountability. A reasonable goal, a necessary goal arguably. The problem is how the law defines software. Because the CRA, as written, applies to virtually any software, including software components used in commercial products, including open source software components, including code written by unpaid developers who never sold anything, who never charged €1, who built something useful and put it on the internet because they wanted to contribute. And suddenly, those 12 people, those 12 volunteers, may find themselves under the same legal framework as the corporations that shipped their code inside billion-dollar products. That is the problem nobody saw coming. Or rather, nobody wanted to see it coming. Let's be precise here, because this story is easy to misunderstand. If the EU is not targeting Linux, the EU is not at war with open source software. Nobody in Brussels sat in a boardroom and said, let's go after the developers who maintain the kernel. What happened is more mundane, and in some ways, more troubling. What happened is that regulators tried to solve a real problem and wrote a law that is broad enough to create a different problem. The real problem is this. For years, the technology industry has shipped connected hardware with appalling security. Routers shipped with default admin passwords that never change. Baby monitors with open video feeds accessible to anyone on the internet. Pacemakers with wireless interfaces that researchers have demonstrated can be exploited remotely. Real vulnerabilities, real harm, real consequences. And the companies responsible for these products faced, essentially, nothing. Because software wasn't treated like a physical product. There was no legal obligation to fix it, no mandatory update cycle, no liability when someone got hurt. The Cyber Resilience Act was designed to change that. Products with digital components that are placed on the EU market must now meet certain security requirements. Manufacturers must report vulnerabilities. They must provide updates. They must take responsibility. That part makes sense. The complication arrives in a specific legal concept. Who counts as a manufacturer? Because if you write code, and that code ends up inside a product sold in Europe, and the CRA's language is interpreted broadly, you might count. You might be the manufacturer. You might carry the liability. The EU, to be fair, recognized this risk. After significant pushback from the open source community, the final version of the CRA includes explicit language attempting to carve out protections for open source developers, specifically developers who aren't engaged in commercial activity. But that phrase, commercial activity, is where the ambiguity begins. When the initial draft of the Cyber Resilience Act circulated, the reaction inside the open source community was not calm. It was the kind of reaction you get when people who understand systems see a structural flaw that others are missing. Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux, rarely raises his voice about policy matters. He builds things, he maintains things, he reviews code. He is not, by nature, a political figure, but his colleagues were alarmed. The Linux Foundation, the Open Source Security Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, dozens of developer organizations. They filed statements, submitted comments, and lobbied hard for changes to the law, and they got some. But the fear didn't fully go away, because the law, even amended, still leaves room for interpretation. And interpretation in legal systems is where ordinary people get hurt. Here's the core concern in simple terms: open source licenses. The legal agreements that govern how code can be used were written in a world without mandatory security liability frameworks. When someone publishes code under the MIT license, or the GPL, or Apache 2.0, they're granting permission for others to use it. They're explicitly disclaiming responsibility. No warranty. Use at your own risk. That has always been the deal. But the CRA doesn't necessarily care what your license says. If your code ends up in a product, when that product ships in Europe, the question becomes, did you profit from this? Are you a commercial actor? And here's the irony. In the Linux ecosystem, commercial is complicated. Many kernel developers are paid employees of major corporations. Red Hat pays people to work on Linux. Google pays people to work on Linux. Microsoft, yes, Microsoft now employs Linux kernel contributors. Those developers are not hobbyists. They are professionals, writing code that goes into a product their employer sells. Are they commercial actors? Their employer might argue no, the code is open source, anyone can use it. The regulator might argue yes, you were paid, your company profits. Your employer sells products containing this code. That ambiguity is not hypothetical. That ambiguity is the litigation waiting to happen. And litigation in regulated industries changes behavior long before a verdict is reached. Because the moment liability becomes possible, real liability, organizations change what they build, how they build it, and most importantly, who they allow to build it. There's a story people tell about Linux that isn't quite true anymore. The story goes, Linux is the ultimate grassroots project, built by the people for the people, a decentralized revolution against corporate software. That story has roots in reality. In 1991, Linus Torvalds was a student. He posted a message to a Usenet group. He said he was working on a free operating system, just a hobby. It was a hobby, and then it wasn't. Today, Linux kernel development is dominated by corporate contributors. According to analysis from the Linux Foundation's own reports, the majority of kernel contributions in recent years come from paid employees of companies like Intel, Red Hat, Google, Samsung, and others. Volunteer hobbyist contributors still exist. Their contributions still matter. The culture of open source still exists. But the center of gravity has shifted. Linux is, in a meaningful sense, corporate infrastructure. It's maintained by corporations, for corporations, used by corporations, to power products that corporations sell. Amazon Web Services runs on Linux. Google's entire infrastructure runs on Linux. Facebook, Netflix, Twitter, Linux. The companies that make the most money from Linux often contribute to it, but they also benefit from a legal gray zone. They use open source code. They build commercial products from it. They disclaim liability using open source license language. And now a regulator is looking at that arrangement and asking a reasonable question. Who is actually responsible when something goes wrong? Linux has had serious security vulnerabilities. So has every major piece of software in the world. But when a vulnerability in the Linux kernel affects a product shipped to consumers in Europe, who answers for it? The kernel developer who wrote that subsystem 6 years ago? The company that integrated it into their device? The company that sold the device? All of them? Under previous law, essentially nobody. Under the CRA, potentially everybody. That shift is not theoretical. It is written into law. In the history of software, the moment that has most reliably destroyed innovation is not technical failure. It's legal exposure. When individuals or small organizations face the possibility of personal liability, not corporate liability, not fines absorbed by a balance sheet, but personal, financial, reputational risk, they stop. They walk away. Not dramatically, not publicly. They just quietly remove their name from projects, stop responding to issues, archive repositories, move on. This has already happened in other industries. When the FDA increased reporting requirements for medical device software, small companies exited the market, not because they couldn't meet the standard, because the cost of demonstrating compliance wasn't worth it at their scale. The standard that was designed to raise the floor ended up raising the barrier to entry, and only the largest players, who had legal departments, compliance teams, and the resources to absorb the cost, remained. This is the fear inside the Linux community. Not that the law is evil, not that regulators are malicious, but that the unintended consequence of a well-intentioned regulation could be the quiet professionalization of open source, in the worst sense of that word. Not professionalism as in quality. Professionalism as in only professionals with institutional backing need apply. Right now, the person who maintains a critical open source library that millions of systems depend on might be someone working out of a spare bedroom, might be a student, might be someone between jobs, might be a retired engineer who just loves building things. Under a strict reading of the CRA, depending on whether that library gets commercially integrated, that person may face the same compliance requirements as a corporation. Vulnerability disclosure processes, security attestations, documentation standards. The EU softened some of this in the final text. There are carve-outs, protections for purely non-commercial development. But carve-outs have edges, and edges, under legal pressure, get interpreted narrowly. Here is where the speculation begins, clearly. Nobody can tell you with certainty how this plays out. Courts interpret law. Implementation takes time. The technology industry adapts in ways nobody predicts. But the concern about hobbyist developers isn't invented. It's based on something that has happened before. When GDPR came into effect in 2018, small websites and small organizations faced a compliance burden they hadn't anticipated. Large corporations adapted. They had legal teams. They could build compliance infrastructure. Small creators, small nonprofits, small community projects. Many of them went quiet. Not because they were doing something wrong, because they couldn't afford to figure out what doing something right looked like. The pattern is consistent enough to be concerning. Regulation written at the scale of corporations often lands unevenly on communities that operate at human scale. And open source development is fundamentally a human scale activity. Even when corporations participate in it, the culture, the ethos, the reason it works is human. It's people caring about something enough to build it for free. And people who care about something for free tend not to have lawyers. The question isn't whether any specific person will be prosecuted for maintaining a Linux driver. That's probably not what happens. The question is whether the ambient legal risk changes behavior before it produces any case at all. Does a developer in Germany think twice before publishing a library, now that they're aware it could be commercially integrated? Does a university student in France decide their kernel contribution isn't worth the complication? Does a maintainer in the Netherlands quietly pass off responsibility for a critical security subsystem because they don't want to be the person whose name is on it when something goes wrong? These decisions happen in private. They never make headlines. But they shape the future of the infrastructure anyway. Here's the irony that deserves attention. The EU's regulatory agenda has largely been framed as a correction to big tech excess, a response to monopoly power, to surveillance capitalism, to platforms that grew so large they became ungovernable. And that framing is not wrong. Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, these companies accumulated power over the last 2 decades that previous generations would have found extraordinary. Platforms that mediate most human communication, systems that know where you are, what you buy, who you know, what you think about, and they largely built that power on open software that others created. Linux underpins Google's cloud. Linux underpins Amazon's cloud. Linux underpins Microsoft's cloud, the same Microsoft that once called Linux a cancer. The irony is sharp. The companies that most benefited from the open source model, that extracted billions of dollars of value from software built by volunteers, are also the companies best positioned to survive a regulatory shift that raises compliance costs. Because when compliance becomes expensive, scale wins. When liability becomes real, legal teams matter. When the cost of building software goes up, the people who can absorb that cost are not the people working in spare bedrooms. There's a version of this story where the Cyber Resilience Act, despite its intentions, ends up concentrating power in the hands of precisely the entities it was designed to constrain. Where the informal, decentralized, non-commercial character of open source development gets replaced by something that looks more like enterprise software. Where the Linux kernel's future is shaped not by the global community of contributors who've built it over 3 decades, but by the compliance departments of the corporations that employ them. That outcome isn't inevitable, but it isn't impossible. And the people who understand the software stack are watching the possibility more carefully than anyone in Brussels. There is another fear, larger and slower, one that doesn't make headlines but lives in the long-term architecture of global technology: fragmentation. The internet and the software ecosystem built around it was designed around a core assumption: that code could move freely across borders, that a developer in Japan could contribute to a project maintained in Finland and used by a company in Brazil, that the infrastructure of computing would be global, collaborative, and open. That assumption still holds, for now, but regulatory divergence is creating pressure on it. The EU has one framework, the United States is building its own, China has had its own for years, India is developing one. Each jurisdiction is now defining what counts as legal software, what counts as secure software, and who bears responsibility for it. And those definitions are not converging. For Linux specifically, a project that is by definition global, the risk is that legal pressure from different directions creates pressure to specialize, that the version of Linux used in European infrastructure becomes subtly different from the version used in American infrastructure, that the compliance requirements of one jurisdiction create technical choices that don't map cleanly onto another. The Linux kernel has maintained extraordinary coherence for 30 years. One codebase, one development process, one global community. That coherence is not guaranteed. It exists because the legal and commercial environment allowed it to exist. Change the environment, and the coherence becomes harder to maintain. No single law breaks this. No single regulation fragments the ecosystem. But regulation compounds, precedent builds, organizations adapt. And after 10 years of adapting to divergent legal frameworks, the global open source community might look considerably less global, less open, less free. Not because anyone decided that's what they wanted, because that's what the incentives produced. So where does this go? The Cyber Resilience Act is law. It's in effect. The phase-in period runs through late 2027. That means the industry has time to adapt, but the clock is running. Several things are likely to happen in parallel. First, the largest open source foundations, the Linux Foundation, the Apache Software Foundation, others, will build compliance infrastructure that individual developers can lean on. This has already started. The idea is to create a kind of legal umbrella, a way for projects to demonstrate CRA compliance without placing the burden on individual contributors. This is a real solution. It may work for many projects, but it also consolidates governance power in large foundations, which creates a different kind of question about who actually controls the open source ecosystem. Second, corporate Linux contributors will adapt their internal processes. Companies like Red Hat, Google, and Intel will build compliance workflows into how their employees contribute to kernel development. This will likely improve some aspects of kernel security, documentation, vulnerability tracking, response processes. It will also make corporate contribution more formal, more structured, more controlled. Whether that's good or bad depends on what you value. Third, truly independent, non-commercial contributors will need clarity. The EU has said it will provide guidance on what commercial means. That guidance matters enormously. If the definition is narrow, if it clearly excludes genuinely non-commercial contributors, many fears may prove unfounded. If the definition is broad, if it captures developers who receive donations, who work on commercially integrated code, who benefit indirectly from their open source reputation, the landscape changes. Does receiving $50 a month in donations make you a commercial actor? Does getting a job offer because of your open source work mean your previous contributions carry commercial weight? Nobody knows yet. The courts will decide, and court decisions take years. In the meantime, developers adapt, cautiously, defensively. Some already are. Repository. README files are being updated with new legal language. Projects are clarifying their licensing posture. Foundations are issuing compliance guidance. The ecosystem is quietly reorganizing itself around a legal framework it never asked for and wasn't designed to accommodate. In 1983, Richard Stallman launched the GNU project. He was angry that a piece of software he wanted to modify was locked down, angry that the ability to understand and improve the tools he used had been taken away. He believed, deeply, philosophically, that software freedom was a moral issue, not just a technical preference, not just a business model, a right. The movement he helped start built the legal and philosophical architecture that made Linux possible. Free software, open source, copyleft. The principle that code, like knowledge, belongs to the commons. It was a radical idea. It worked. Linux now runs more of the world than most people will ever understand. It is in the satellites, in the submarines, in the phone in your pocket, in the machine that processed your last medical scan. It is perhaps the most successful collaborative human engineering project in history, built on the assumption that people will give their time and skill freely if the conditions allow it. And now those conditions are being renegotiated. Not violently, not suddenly, quietly, legally, bureaucratically. Through the slow machinery of institutional regulation, well-intentioned, genuinely necessary in parts, and structurally blind to the kind of human ecosystem it is about to reshape. The Cyber Resilience Act may improve security. It probably will in some ways, but it will also change who builds the software and who decides how it gets built. And who carries the risk when something goes wrong? Those decisions shape technology for decades. The question that nobody in a position of institutional power is seriously asking is this: what do we lose when the informal becomes formal? What disappears when a community becomes a compliance structure? What gets built when liability is everywhere and passion is nowhere? The infrastructure of the digital world was not built by committees. It was not built by compliance departments. It was not built by legal teams optimizing for regulatory posture. It was built by people who cared, who stayed up late because a problem interested them, who shared what they made because that felt like the right thing to do, who trusted that the system they were building would outlast the circumstances that created them. That trust is now being tested, not by hackers, not by corporate sabotage, by a law written in good faith, by people who may not fully understand what they're regulating. And the test may take years to resolve. The internet was built on the assumption that knowledge wants to be free. The question is whether institutions will let it stay that way.